Isn't it strange how the very things we build, the things we pour our lives into, can sometimes become the reason we're told we're no longer needed? It's a quiet sort of heartbreak. But sometimes what feels like an ending is really just clearing the path for something unexpected. Something. Right? Let's sit with a story about that today. Imagine a man named Mark Foster. He's 55 years old, and for the last 18 years, he's been the heart and soul of the engineering department at a company called Veltria Housing. Not just a manager, not just an employee, he was the architect. The one who laid the foundation, literally, for their entire digital infrastructure, back when they were just a small local firm called Bayview Properties. 18 years. Think about that. Nearly 2 decades dedicated to one place, one mission. Mark wasn't just punching a clock. He was building a legacy. He watched the company grow from a handful of apartment complexes to a major player managing properties across 4 states. And every step of the way, it was Mark's mind, his hands, his foresight that built the complex, integrated systems that made it all possible. Tenant applications, background checks, maintenance requests, rent collection, everything flowed through the digital veins he had meticulously designed and implemented. He wasn't just overseeing teams. Much of the critical core code was written by Mark himself. Late nights, weekends, pouring his expertise into creating something robust, something reliable, something that worked so flawlessly, day in and day out, that the people in the executive suites, the ones making the big decisions, started to forget. They forgot the complexity humming beneath the surface. They forgot how fragile it all could be without the right hand guiding it. They forgot how much the entire operation, 63 properties strong, depended entirely on the systems Mark had built and intimately understood, until they decided he cost too much. Graham leans forward, a faint smirk playing on his lips. It's not malicious, perhaps just indifferent, utterly detached from the human impact of the words he's about to deliver. "Mark," he begins, his tone attempting casualness but failing. "We've been looking at the budget, streamlining operations, and honestly, we can get 3 junior engineers for what we're paying you." He pauses, maybe expecting a reaction, an outburst. But Mark just sits there, absorbing the blow. Graham continues, "Nothing personal, you understand. It's just cost-cutting. Business decision." Beside Graham sits Diane from Human Resources. She avoids eye contact, slides a standard issue folder across the polished table. "The severance package is quite generous, Mark," she murmurs, her voice professionally flat. 2 months' salary, plus your accrued vacation time. Mark takes the folder. His hands are steady. He looks from Graham to Diane, then back to Graham. 18 years of dedication, innovation, problem-solving reduced to a simple, impersonal calculation. He nods slowly. "Thank you," he says, his voice quiet but firm. "Is that all?" Graham seems almost disappointed. Perhaps he'd prepped for an argument, for threats of legal action. Something dramatic he could report back to the board, painting Mark as difficult, unreasonable. Mark's quiet acceptance throws him off script. "Well," Graham recovers, "most people in your position, they have questions, concerns." Mark offers a slight shrug, a gesture not of defeat, but of finality. "Seems pretty straightforward to me." Graham exchanges a puzzled glance with Diane. They don't get it. They mistake his stillness for calm, perhaps even apathy. What they can't see is the profound sense of doneness settling over him. It's not about fighting this decision. It's about recognizing the end of a chapter he didn't choose to close, but one that has been closed for him nonetheless. There's a difference between calm and just being finished. "Well," Graham pushes on, regaining his corporate composure, "we would appreciate your help with the transition, of course. The new engineering team, they'll need some guidance. Understanding the system architecture. Perhaps we could arrange a consulting agreement, just for a few weeks, to ensure a smooth handover." Mark meets his gaze. "I'll think about it," he says, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He already knows the answer is no. Why would he train the people hired to replace him at a fraction of his worth, to navigate a system the company refused to properly invest in documenting? They shake hands. The contact feels cold, perfunctory. Mark walks back to his office, the one he'd occupied for over a decade. He doesn't make a scene. He doesn't vent or complain. He methodically clears out his desk. 18 years of work, of memories, of small professional triumphs, condensed into the sterile confines of a single cardboard box. Photos, a few awards, technical manuals he'd practically memorized. It feels impossibly small, tragically inadequate. As he walks through the office, box in hand, he passes colleagues. Some offer quick, sympathetic glances. Others look away awkwardly, nervously, perhaps wondering if they're next on Graham's chopping block. The fear is palpable, a heavy blanket smothering the usual office buzz. He doesn't linger, nods a quiet goodbye to a few familiar faces and heads towards the parking garage. His truck, his reliable companion for countless commutes, waits patiently. As he slides into the driver's seat, placing the box on the passenger side, his phone buzzes. A text message. It's from Alan, the database administrator Mark had hired 12 years ago. Someone he'd mentored, someone he trusted. The message reads, "Boss? Heard the news. This is insane. The whole team's freaking out. What's going on?" Mark looks at the message, feels a pang of connection to the team he's leaving behind. But he can't engage. Not now. He puts the phone down, starts the engine, and drives away from Veltria housing for the last time. The weight of that single cardboard box feeling heavier than 18 years of work ever did. He drives home. His house overlooks Lake Ontario, a place of peace for him. He bypasses the living room, walks straight out onto the deck. The late afternoon sun is beginning its descent, painting the vast expanse of water in shifting shades of copper and rose. He pours himself a generous glass of bourbon, sinks into a chair, and just watches. Watches the light fade, listens to the gentle lap of water against the distant shore. His wife, Sarah, comes out quietly, places a comforting hand on his shoulder. She doesn't need to ask what happened. She's seen the storm clouds gathering for months. "What will you do now?" she asks softly, her voice filled with support, not pressure. Mark takes a slow sip of his bourbon, the warmth spreading through his chest, a small comfort against the chill of the day's events. He shrugs, a gesture less of uncertainty and more of quiet resolve. "Something will turn up," he says, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It always does. And here's the thing. Here's what Graham Vickers, with his shiny MBA and his focus on spreadsheets, didn't know. What he hadn't bothered to learn in his whirlwind 6 months of modernizing. Mark hadn't just designed Veltria's systems. He had built significant portions of them himself, writing custom code, intricate scripts, unique solutions tailored precisely to the company's evolving needs. And crucially, because Veltria had always balked at the cost, Mark's repeated requests for a dedicated documentation team, for the resources to properly map out and explain the complex architecture he'd created, had always been denied. "Too expensive," they'd said. "We'll get to it next quarter." That quarter never arrived. The result? Vast sections of the system, the critical nuts and bolts holding the entire operation together, existed primarily in one place: Mark Foster's head. Only he truly understood the deep redundancies he'd built in for stability. Only he knew the hidden security layers protecting sensitive tenant data. Only he grasped the intricate dance of the network architecture that kept 63 properties running smoothly. And sitting there, watching the sunset paint the sky, Mark Foster had absolutely no intention of drawing them a map. Let's rewind a little just to understand the depth of this. Mark started with Bayview Properties when it was just a small dream run by a man named Harold Bay. 4 apartment buildings, a dozen employees. Their IT infrastructure? 2 dusty desktop computers, a clunky fax machine, and a dial-up modem that screeched like a banshee. Harold, a man with vision but limited tech knowledge, had hired Mark away from a consulting gig. "We're growing, Mark," Harold had said. his eyes alight with possibility. I need someone smart, someone who can build us something solid, something that lasts. And Mark did. Over 18 years, he nurtured that rudimentary setup, transforming it into a sophisticated, integrated property management system that became the envy of competitors. He built it piece by piece, adapting, upgrading, refining as Bayview properties grew, acquired more buildings, expanded into new states. It was his baby, grown from infancy to complex adulthood under his careful watch. Then, about 5 years ago, Harold retired. His son, Justin, who lacked his father's passion for the business, quickly sold the company to a private equity firm. They slapped on a new corporate-sounding name, Veltria Housing, and brought in their own people. Initially, they kept Mark on. They had to. They were impressed, even intimidated, by the complexity and efficiency of the system he'd built. They knew, at first, that they couldn't run the place without him. But private equity operates differently. The focus shifted. Long-term stability, Harold Bay's guiding principle, took a back seat to quarterly targets, short-term gains, and maximizing profit margins for an eventual resale. The culture changed. It became colder, more transactional. The warning signs for Mark came gradually, like a slow tide creeping in. First, the repeated rejection of his proposals for a documentation team. Budgets were tight, they said, always tight when it came to investing in foundational stability. Then came the consultants, young, ambitious MBA types, just like Graham Vickers, full of jargon about disrupting property management and leveraging cloud solutions. Mark would patiently sit through meetings, explaining the intricacies of the existing custom system, the reasons why their proposed off-the-shelf software wouldn't integrate, why a rip-and-replace approach would be catastrophic. He'd show them the lines of custom code, the unique architecture that made Veltria's system so powerful, so tailored. Their eyes would glaze over. They didn't understand, and worse, they didn't seem to want to understand. It wasn't standardized. It wasn't easily quantifiable on a balance sheet aimed at attracting buyers. Eventually, the invitations to key planning meetings stopped coming. Mark found himself increasingly isolated, his expertise dismissed as legacy thinking. Sarah saw it clearly, long before Mark allowed himself to. "They're pushing you out, Mark," she'd said one evening over dinner, her voice laced with concern. "They see you, your knowledge, as a roadblock to whatever quick changes they want to make. You need to prepare yourself." Mark, ever the loyal engineer, had brushed her concerns aside, perhaps blinded by his own creation. "They need me, Sarah," he'd insisted. "No one else understands how this whole thing fits together. They can't afford to lose me." Her reply, chillingly prescient, echoed in his mind now. That might be exactly the problem, Mark. Maybe they think they can't afford not to. 6 months ago, Graham Vickers arrived as the new CTO, brought in from a completely different industry, banking software. He immediately started talking about standardization, eliminating legacy dependencies, future-proofing. He hired 3 junior engineers, fresh out of college, bright but utterly inexperienced in the specific complexities of Veltria's world. He assigned them to shadow Mark, learn the ropes, ask questions. Mark, ever the professional, answered their questions patiently. He tried to explain the interconnectedness, the fail-safes, the logic behind his designs. But he could see they weren't grasping it. How could they? It had taken him years, decades, to build that deep, intuitive understanding, to anticipate potential problems, to weave in the redundancies that kept the lights on when minor glitches inevitably occurred. These young engineers were learning syntax, not systems thinking. They were learning tools, not architecture. Then, last week, Graham had stopped by Mark's office, all casual efficiency. "Quick meeting tomorrow morning. Mark? 9 a.m.? Just a quarterly check-in." So routine, so bland. Mark hadn't suspected a thing. He should have. He really should have seen it coming. 2 weeks. 2 weeks passed after Mark walked out of Veltria Housing with his life packed in a cardboard box. He spent the time updating his resume, networking quietly, reconnecting with old contacts. He didn't wallow. He started sketching out ideas for new systems, new approaches, his mind already moving forward. He and Sarah took long walks by the lake, talking about possibilities, about what a new chapter might look like. There was a sense of release, almost alongside the sting of betrayal. Then the first call came. He was in his home office, refining a cover letter, when his phone buzzed. Caller ID Graham Vickers. Mark let it go to voicemail. He wasn't ready. Or maybe he was simply unwilling. A minute later, the notification popped up. Voicemail from Graham. Mark listened, a curious detachment settling over him. Click. Victor. Mark. It's Graham. Graham Vickers. Listen, we seem to be having some minor issues with the tenant portal. Graham's voice, usually so confident, had a slight edge of uncertainty. The junior team, they're working on it, boots on the ground, but they're having a little trouble understanding some of your code architecture. The way things connect. A pause. Could you possibly give us a call back? Just a quick chat, maybe point them in the right direction? It would just be a quick consultation, nothing major. Click. Mark stared at his phone. Minor issues? Trouble understanding? He knew his code. He knew the portal. It wasn't minor. He deleted the message and went back to his resume. 3 more calls came from Graham that day. Each voicemail sounded a little tighter, a little more strained. The minor issues were clearly escalating. By evening, another text from Alan. His former database admin system's been down all day. Tenant portal is completely offline. Maintenance requests aren't processing. People can't pay rent online. Graham is losing his mind. Absolute chaos here. Mark read the text, felt a grim sense of inevitability, but no satisfaction. Just confirmation. This is what happens when you value spreadsheets over experience. This is what happens when you sever the nerve center without understanding the nervous system. The next morning, his phone rang again. This time, it was Diane from HR. Her voice was smoother, more practiced in the art of delicate negotiation than Graham's panicked pleas. Mark? Hi, it's Diane from Veltria HR. Hope you're doing well. Professional pleasantries first. Mark, I'm calling because, well, following up on Graham's messages yesterday, we seem to be experiencing some unexpected technical difficulties. Nothing systemic, of course, just transition hiccups. She paused, gauging his silence. The board was wondering, we'd like to formally discuss a consulting arrangement, strictly temporary, of course, just to help the new team navigate these initial challenges, ensure continuity of service for our residents. The compensation, Mark, would be quite generous. Mark picked up the phone this time. His voice was calm, measured. How generous, Diane? There was a slight hesitation on her end. She probably had a lower number approved initially. We're authorized to offer $300 per hour, with a minimum 4-hour engagement for any call-out. $300 an hour. Considerably more than his salaried rate, but still insulting considering the circumstances. Considering they were asking him to fix the problem they created by deeming him too expensive in the first place. He let the silence stretch for a beat. I'll think about it, Diane, he said finally. I'll review my availability and get back to you. Then he hung up. He walked into the kitchen where Sarah was reading the morning paper, a steaming cup of coffee waiting for him. He stared out the window at the calm surface of Lake Ontario, the deep blue stretching to the horizon. Sarah looked up, reading his expression. What are you thinking? She asked gently. Mark took a slow sip of coffee. A small, wry smile touched his lips. I'm thinking, he said quietly. They're finally starting to find out exactly what I was worth. Over the next 3 days, the situation at Veltria clearly went from bad to worse. The calls became a relentless barrage. Graham, his voice now bordering on frantic. Diane, her professional facade cracking, sounding increasingly stressed. Even Justin Bayou, Harold Bay's son, the one who sold the company and now sat passively on the board, left a hesitant message. Mark? Justin Bayou here. Heard there are some glitches? Give me a call if you have a moment. The picture emerging from the panicked voicemails and Alan's increasingly alarmed texts was grim. The tenant portal wasn't just glitchy, it was completely down. The automated maintenance scheduling system was spitting out errors, leaving tenants without service and contractors confused. Most critically, the automatic payment processing system had failed. Thousands of residents couldn't pay their rent electronically, and Veltria couldn't collect it. Cash flow was grinding to a halt. Reputations were on the line. Panic was setting in. Mark listened to the messages, deleted them, and didn't respond. He wasn't playing hard to get. He wasn't trying to punish them, not actively. He was simply unavailable. He was moving on. This was their problem to solve, a direct consequence of their own business decision. On the fourth day, amidst the flurry of desperate calls from Veltria, a different kind of notification arrived. An email. It wasn't from Veltria. It was from Devlin Systems, a well-respected regional competitor. Smaller than Veltria, perhaps, managing fewer properties, but known for steady growth and a solid reputation. The email wasn't from HR. It was from the director of technology himself, Lawrence Devlin. The subject line was simple: checking in opportunity discussion. The email read, "Victor, Mark, I heard through the industry grapevine about your recent departure from Veltria. Firstly, wanted to say I've always admired your work from afar. That integrated system you built is something of a legend. Secondly, on the off chance you're considering your next steps, I'd be very interested in talking. Devlin Systems is embarking on a major infrastructure upgrade for our own property management platform, and we're looking for experienced leadership. Would you be open to a confidential conversation? Best, Lawrence Devlin." Mark read the email twice. Lawrence Devlin. He knew the name, respected the company. This wasn't a desperate plea. It was a proactive reach out from a peer who recognized his value. A flicker of something warm, something akin to hope, sparked within him. He typed a brief, professional reply, suggesting they meet the following day. That evening, Mark and Sarah were in the kitchen, prepping dinner. Music played softly. The aroma of garlic and herbs filled the air. Felt normal, peaceful. Then the doorbell rang. Unexpected. Mark went to the door, wiping his hands on a towel. He opened it, and his blood ran cold for a second. Standing on his porch, looking utterly wrecked, was Graham Vickers. His expensive designer glasses were slightly askew. His usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, tie loosened. His hair was a mess. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Mark," Graham began, his voice strained, skipping the pleasantries. "Mark, I apologize. I know I shouldn't just drop by unannounced like this, but we have an emergency, a critical situation." Mark leaned casually against the doorframe, projecting a calm he didn't entirely feel. "Oh, the entire system is down, Mark. Everything. Nothing is working. Tenant portal, payments, maintenance, internal comms. It's all gone dark. The junior team, they're completely lost. They can't figure out what's wrong, let alone how to fix it. We're hemorrhaging money, Mark. Tenants are furious." Graham ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "We need you. We desperately need your help." Mark remained silent, just looking at him. "The board," Graham continued, his voice rising slightly in desperation, "they've authorized me to offer you, whatever it takes, a substantial consulting fee. $500 an hour? More? Name your price, Mark. Just, please, help us." $500 an hour. Less than 48 hours ago, it was $300. Mark thought about the cardboard box sitting in his garage, holding 18 years of his professional life. He thought about Graham's smirk in the termination meeting. Nothing personal, just cost-cutting. He thought about the denied requests for a documentation team, the warnings ignored, the expertise dismissed. He thought about the email from Lawrence Devlin sitting in his inbox, offering respect and opportunity. He looked Graham Vickers straight in the eye. His voice was quiet, devoid of anger or triumph, just stating a fact. "Graham," he said softly, "I'm really sorry to hear about your troubles. That sounds serious." He paused, letting the weight of the word hang in the air. "But I can't help you. I have an interview tomorrow morning." He allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible echo of his own earlier words. "Something turned up, just like I thought it might." He saw the flicker of disbelief, then dawning horror, in Graham's eyes. Before Graham could sputter another desperate plea, Mark gently, firmly, closed the door. He leaned against it for a moment, listening to the silence on the other side, then the sound of retreating footsteps. He went back into the warm, fragrant kitchen where Sarah was waiting, and for the first time since that cold, sterile termination meeting, a profound sense of peace washed over him. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not revenge. Just clarity. Crystal clear clarity. He wasn't going back. He wasn't going to fix what they had so carelessly broken. Some lessons, it seemed, had to be learned the hard way. The meeting with Lawrence Devlin the next day felt like stepping into a different world. They met at a quiet coffee shop downtown, away from the orbits of both Veltria and Devlin systems. Lawrence was perhaps a few years older than Mark, with a calm demeanor and eyes that suggested he actually listened. "Mark, thanks for meeting me," Lawrence began, stirring his coffee. "As I said in my email, I've followed your work for years. That integrated property management system you built over at Veltria. Honestly, it's legendary in our little corner of the industry. Nobody else has managed to build anything quite that comprehensive, that seamless." Mark felt a flush of pride, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. "Thank you, Lawrence. Took time. A lot of time and effort. And that's exactly what I want to talk about," Lawrence said, leaning forward slightly. "Time, effort, and expertise. We're at a point where we need to significantly upgrade our own systems. We've outgrown our current setup. But frankly, Mark, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and we certainly don't want to start from scratch and make the same mistakes others have. We need someone who understands the deep architecture, the integration points, the security layers, the scalability challenges. Someone who knows how to build something not just for today, but for years down the road. Someone who can build us something better, more robust, more future-proof than what's currently out there." Mark listened intently. This wasn't just a job offer. It was an invitation to build again, but this time, potentially, with the right support, the right vision. "I'm interested," Mark said simply. Lawrence smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Good, because I'm prepared to offer you the position of Chief Systems Architect at Devlin Systems. Full benefits package, naturally. Significant stock options, because we want you invested in our long-term success. And," he paused, naming a salary figure, "a starting salary 20% higher than what I believe you were making at Veltria." It was a strong offer, a very strong offer. Almost too good, Mark thought, a flicker of caution tempering his interest. "Lawrence, if I may ask, why me? There are younger engineers out there. Cheaper ones, certainly." He heard the echo of Graham Vickers' logic in his own question and inwardly winced. Lawrence let out a short laugh. "You sound like your former employer, Mark. And believe me, we considered that route. In fact, we tried it. Hired 3 incredibly bright young engineers straight out of top universities a couple of years ago. Tasked them with building our next-gen platform." He sighed. "They built us something sleek, modern-looking, that crashes every time we get more than 100 simultaneous users trying to access tenant data. It looks great on the surface, but it's fundamentally unstable at scale." He met Mark's gaze directly. "We don't need cheap, Mark. We need reliable. We need experienced. We need someone who understands that building robust systems isn't about flashy features. It's about solid foundations. We need you." The conviction in Lawrence's voice, the clear understanding of the difference between superficial appearances and deep, functional expertise, it resonated deeply with Mark. This was the respect, the validation, he hadn't even realized he'd been craving. He accepted the offer the next day. Meanwhile, the Veltria dumpster fire continued to rage. Alan, Mark's former colleague, kept him updated through occasional, discreet texts. Apparently, they had managed to get some parts of the system partially restored after days of complete outage, likely through frantic, costly efforts. But critical functions were still failing intermittently. Tenant data was unreliable. Payment processing was a mess. They'd been forced to bring in an incredibly expensive emergency consulting firm, specialists in legacy system recovery, who were charging astronomical hourly rates just to try and stabilize the bleeding. About a week after Mark started his new role at Devlin Systems, settling into his office, meeting his new team, starting to sketch out the initial architecture for Devlin's future platform, his phone rang. Caller ID Graham Vickers. Mark hesitated. He almost ignored it. But something, maybe a lingering sense of professional courtesy, or perhaps just morbid curiosity, made him pick up. Mark. Graham's voice was stripped bare of any pretense now. Just raw desperation. Mark, please. You have to listen. It's getting really serious. We think we've lost access to payment records. For the past 3 months, tenants are calling, complaining about incorrect charges, double billing, missed payments that they swear they made. The consulting team, they're saying they can't make sense of the database structure without input from the original architect. They need your input, Mark. Urgently. Lost payment records? For 3 months? Oh my gosh. Mark knew exactly how complex and protected that part of the database was. He'd designed it that way deliberately to prevent tampering. Accessing historical, encrypted financial data required following very specific, multi-layered protocols he himself had established. Protocols the new team and likely the consultants wouldn't know. Protocols that weren't documented anywhere because Veltria hadn't funded documentation. Mark took a slow breath. Graham, he said, keeping his voice level. I understand you're in a difficult position, but as I told you, I'm employed elsewhere now. I signed an exclusive contract with Devlin Systems. I'm afraid I simply can't help you. It would be a conflict of interest, not to mention a violation of my agreement here. We'll double whatever Devlin is paying you. Graham blurted out, the panic making him reckless. Just for 2 days, Mark. 48 hours of your time. That's all we're asking. Name your price. Mark closed his eyes for a brief moment. It wasn't about the money. It had never really been about the money, not in that way. Graham, he said firmly, it's not about the money. There was a pause on the other end. Then Graham's voice turned cold, sharp, laced with accusation. Then what is it about? Revenge? Is that it? Are you enjoying this? Watching us struggle? Did you set this up somehow? That was it. The accusation. The implication that he, Mark, would deliberately sabotage his own work, the system he'd poured 18 years into building and maintaining. That was the final, unforgivable insult. Mark's hand tightened slightly on the phone. The anger he hadn't allowed himself to fully feel until now surged, hot and sharp. But he kept his voice steady, dangerously calm. No, Graham, he said slowly. I'm not enjoying it. Not one bit. But let's be clear. You made a business decision. You decided that my 18 years of experience, my intimate knowledge of the systems I built, wasn't worth the cost. You dismissed my warnings. You ignored my requests for resources like documentation. Now, his voice dropped slightly. Now you're simply discovering the actual cost of that decision. You're experiencing the consequences. Another silence. Then, Graham seemed to shift gears, trying a different tactic. The board. They want to discuss bringing you back, Mark. Full reinstatement. Your previous salary, plus a significant signing bonus. We acknowledge mistakes were made. For a fleeting moment, Mark felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. They wanted him back. They admitted they were wrong. But it faded almost instantly. Going back? Into that same environment? With the same executives who had deemed him expendable just weeks ago? They hadn't fundamentally changed. They were just desperate. The moment the crisis passed, they'd be looking for the next opportunity to cut corners, to trim costs, starting with him. It would solve nothing. It would just postpone the inevitable. "Graham," Mark said, his voice final. "I appreciate the offer. Truly. But it's too late. I've made a commitment to Lawrence Devlin and Devlin Systems. I'm building something new here. I'm moving forward." Graham's voice hardened again, turning venomous. The veiled threat Mark had half expected finally surfaced. "You know, Mark, there could be legal implications here. If we discover, through our investigation, that you intentionally designed our systems to be overly complex, difficult to maintain without your specific knowledge, non-compete clauses, intellectual property concerns, perhaps even deliberate sabotage." There it was. The blame shift. The attempt to make him the villain in the story they authored. Mark didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Graham," he replied evenly, cutting through the bluster. "The system is exactly as it was when I left it. The same system the company repeatedly denied my requests for funding a proper documentation team over the past 5 years. Every single line of code I wrote belongs to Veltria Housing, as clearly specified in my employment contract. I have taken absolutely nothing with me except my knowledge and my experience." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "But please, feel free to have your lawyers contact mine if you believe you have a case. I'm sure it would be illuminating." He didn't wait for a response. He pressed end call, his hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer, righteous anger of being falsely accused after years of dedication. The accusation of sabotage was the final straw, severing any lingering thread of connection he might have felt to his former employer. He took a deep breath, looked around his new office at Devlin Systems, at the whiteboards filled with promising architectural diagrams. Here he was starting fresh, building systems properly from the ground up, with full support for documentation, with training programs planned for the growing engineering team, with robust redundancies designed to prevent exactly the kind of catastrophe Veltria was now experiencing. He wasn't going to look back anymore. He wasn't going to offer them a lifeline. Some lessons, he thought again grimly, just had to be learned the hard way, the expensive way. Life settled into a productive rhythm at Devlin Systems. Mark thrived in the environment Lawrence Devlin was fostering, collaborative, respectful of expertise, focused on long-term quality. He was deep into designing the new platform, working closely with a small, dedicated team, laying the groundwork for something truly scalable and robust. About a month after he started, he got an unexpected visitor. Alan, his former database administrator from Veltria, stood awkwardly in the doorway of his office, clutching a laptop bag. He looked tired but relieved. "Hey boss. Mark," Alan corrected himself with a small smile. "Got time for a quick lunch?" "My treat." They went to a nearby deli, finding a quiet booth in the back amidst the lunchtime bustle. Over pastrami sandwiches and pickles, Alan filled Mark in on the ongoing chaos at Veltria. "Mark, it's even worse than you probably heard," Alan said, lowering his voice instinctively, even though no one could overhear them. "They're still scrambling. That expensive consulting firm? They're basically billing by the minute and making minimal progress. They managed to stabilize some things, but the core data integrity issues, they're massive." He leaned closer. "Get this, they think they've lost access to historical tenant data going back 3 years. Lease agreements, payment histories, maintenance records, potentially corrupted, maybe gone. The backup systems, they're corrupted somehow too." Mark wasn't entirely surprised, though the scale of it was staggering. He knew the backup protocols were complex, designed with multiple security triggers. If someone tried to force access or bypass a step, say, in a panic, the system was designed to lock down and protect the data, potentially rendering it inaccessible without the precise recovery keys and procedures. Procedures only he and perhaps Alan fully understood. Procedures that, again, were never formally documented. "That's not all," Alan continued. his expression turning grim. While I was digging around, trying to help the consultants make sense of the payment processing database, before I decided I'd had enough, I found something. He hesitated, then opened his laptop, shielding the screen slightly. Graham, Vickers, he'd been planning your termination for months. Mark, it wasn't just a sudden cost-cutting move. Mark felt a chill despite the warm deli air. How do you know? Alan navigated through some archived folders, pulling up a series of emails. Emails between Graham Vickers and key members of the Veltria board, dating back several months before Mark was fired. They discussed, in cold, calculating terms, a legacy staff reduction plan. Mark's name was explicitly mentioned as the primary target, the first one to go. He sold them a bill of goods, Alan explained, scrolling through the messages. Told them your custom infrastructure was unnecessarily complex, a barrier to modernization. Claimed you'd made yourself indispensable by design, not necessity. He promised them he could replace you with cheaper junior engineers and transition the entire company to cheaper, off-the-shelf software solutions within 6 months. Alan pointed to a specific line in an email from Graham. He projected annual cost savings of over $1 million by cutting you and implementing his streamlined approach. Mark read the words, feeling a strange sense of detachment replacing the earlier anger. It wasn't just incompetence or short-sightedness. It was a deliberate, calculated plan, built on misrepresenting his work and undermining his value to justify his removal. There's more, Alan said quietly, closing the laptop lid. You know the private equity firm that owns Veltria? They've been planning to sell the company. Have been for over a year apparently. Graham Vickers wasn't brought in to fix Veltria or make it better long-term. He was brought in specifically to slash costs, puff up the short-term profit margins, and make the company look more attractive for a quick flip. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The relentless push for standardization, even when it made no technical sense. The resistance to funding proper documentation, which would have revealed the system's true complexity and value. The sudden focus on shedding senior, experienced staff. It wasn't about building a better company. It was about dressing up a pig for market. Mark Foster, with his deep knowledge and his insistence on doing things right, was an obstacle to that quick, potentially misleading pre-sale makeover. Mark looked at Alan. Why are you showing me this, Alan? And why aren't you still there, trying to help? Alan closed his laptop, a look of finality on his face. Because I quit yesterday, Mark. Handed in my notice. And I'm not the only one. Half the remaining experienced IT department has walked out in the last 2 weeks. Morale is non-existent. The consultants are now estimating it will take at least 6 months, maybe longer, just to restore full functionality, assuming the data isn't permanently lost. They might have to rebuild huge chunks from scratch. He hesitated again, then added, and Veltria's biggest client, Westbrook Properties? They manage a huge portfolio. They're considering jumping ship. They've completely lost faith in Veltria's management and the reliability of the system. Westbrook Properties. Mark knew them well. They represented nearly 30% of Veltria's annual revenue. Losing them would be a devastating blow, catastrophic even, especially if Veltria was trying to find a buyer. Wow, Mark breathed out. So what will you do now? Alan managed a genuine grin for the first time. Actually, he said, leaning back, I was hoping maybe Devlin Systems might be hiring experienced database administrators? Someone who knows how to handle complex migrations, perhaps. Later that afternoon, Mark walked into Lawrence Devlin's office and laid out the situation regarding Alan, his skills, his experience, his intimate knowledge of Veltria's database structure, which could be invaluable if Devlin ever needed to migrate data from a Veltria acquisition, Mark thought with sudden foresight, and his recent departure. Lawrence didn't hesitate. Hire him, he said immediately. Sounds like exactly the kind of person we need as we scale up. We're building a team here, Mark. Brick by brick. People who understand what it means to build systems that last, who value quality. That evening, Mark's phone rang. Graham Vickers again. Mark almost didn't answer but decided to one last time. Graham's voice had lost all its previous edge, no arrogance. No threats, just the thin, reedy sound of utter defeat. Mark, Victor, please. The use of his first name felt jarringly intimate after everything. The situation, it's critical. Westbrook Properties, they're threatening to terminate their contract. Officially. Tomorrow. The board, they're questioning my leadership, my decisions. A desperate pause. We need your help. There has to be something you can do. Just talk to the consultants? Point them somewhere? Mark felt a wave of weariness wash over him. I'm sorry, Graham, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. I told you, I can't help you. Name your price. Graham pleaded the same desperate refrain. Anything, Mark. Anything. It's not about price, Graham, Mark repeated patiently. It never was. It's about respect. Respect for experience. Respect for the work, the dedication that goes into building something complex, something reliable, something right the first time. It's about understanding true value, not just quarterly costs. The line was silent for a long moment. Then, Graham spoke again, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a dawning, horrifying realization. You knew, he said. You knew this would happen, didn't you? When you left. You knew exactly what would break and when. Mark closed his eyes. No, Graham, he said truthfully. I didn't know exactly what would break or when. I just knew what I had built. I knew its complexities, its strengths, and its dependencies. And I knew what it took to maintain it properly. He paused, letting the final point land. Information I tried to share with you, with management many, many times. Information you chose to ignore. He ended the call, feeling no triumph, no satisfaction, no regret. Just the quiet, unshakable certainty that some failures are self-inflicted wounds. And some lessons learned too late carry the heaviest price. Things moved quickly after that. The industry is smaller than people think, and news travels fast, especially news of a major player like Veltria stumbling so badly. 2 months into Mark's tenure at Devlin Systems, just as the architecture for the new platform was taking solid shape, Lawrence called him into his office. Lawrence looked energized, focused. Mark, sit down. I just got off the phone with Jeffrey Westbrook, Lawrence said, naming the CEO of Westbrook Properties, Veltria's largest and now former client. It's official. They served Veltria with termination papers this morning. Their contract ends in 30 days. He paused, leaning forward. And Jeffrey wants to know if Devlin Systems can handle their portfolio. All of it. Mark felt his breath catch. Westbrook Properties managed over 10,000 residential units across the Northeast. Taking them on would more than double Devlin's current operations overnight. It was a massive opportunity, a game changer. But, Lawrence, that's huge, Mark said honestly. But we're not ready. Not yet. The new system is coming along well, ahead of schedule even, but it's maybe halfway built. We don't have the capacity, the infrastructure, or the fully tested platform to handle that kind of scale right now. Lawrence nodded, anticipating the objection. I know it's a stretch, Mark, but Jeffrey is desperate. Veltria's failures are becoming a public relations nightmare for Westbrook. Tenants are complaining. Regulators might start sniffing around. He needs a stable, reliable partner, and he needs one fast. He knows we're building something solid, partly because he knows you're here building it. He looked Mark straight in the eye. He's willing to give us 12 weeks, 3 months, to get ready. And, importantly, he's willing to help fund the necessary infrastructure expansion to make it happen. 12 weeks. To essentially complete and scale a complex system build that would normally take 6 to 9 months. It was an audacious timeline. This was the moment. The turning point Mark hadn't necessarily sought, but which had presented itself as a direct consequence of Veltria's collapse. If Devlin Systems could pull this off, If they could successfully onboard Westbrook Properties, it would instantly establish them as a major force in the property management technology space. It would be the ultimate validation of Mark's work, his approach. But if they failed, if they couldn't deliver, it could potentially sink both Devlin and Westbrook's operational stability. The stakes were incredibly high. "Let me think about the architecture," Mark said after a moment, his mind already racing, calculating, strategizing. "Let me see what a realistic, accelerated roadmap looks like. I'll draw up a plan, assess the risks, the resource needs. I'll have something for you by tomorrow morning." Mark barely slept that night. Fueled by coffee and adrenaline, he spread blueprints and diagrams across his dining room table. He sketched system flows, mapped out complex data migration pathways from whatever format Westbrook used, considered scaling challenges, server requirements, security protocols under pressure. By dawn, bleary-eyed but focused, he had a plan. It was ambitious, incredibly ambitious, but he believed it was achievable. It involved a hybrid approach, modular components, and a phased rollout strategy that would allow Devlin to onboard Westbrook's properties region by region, minimizing risk and disruption. When he presented the detailed plan to Lawrence later that morning, Lawrence studied it carefully, asking sharp, insightful questions. Finally, he nodded slowly. "This looks solid, Mark. Very solid. Impressive work overnight." He tapped a section of the timeline. "But I notice you've included a substantial documentation phase here. 3 full weeks dedicated just to documentation, right in the middle of this crunch time. Is that absolutely essential? Couldn't we streamline that to buy us more time on development?" Mark met Lawrence's gaze firmly. "Lawrence," he said, his voice unwavering, "it's non-negotiable. That phase stays exactly as it is. That's precisely where Veltria failed. They cut corners on documentation, on knowledge transfer, on training. They created single points of failure." He leaned forward slightly. "We don't do that here. We document everything meticulously from day one. We cross-train the team on every critical component. We build resilience and shared knowledge into the foundation. No single points of failure. Not personnel, not systems. That's how we ensure we can deliver for Westbrook, not just in 12 weeks, but for the long haul." Lawrence held his gaze for a moment, then nodded decisively. "Okay, Mark, I trust your judgment. You've earned that. 3 weeks for documentation it is. Let's move forward. Let's make this happen." The next 10 weeks were a whirlwind, an intense, focused, exhilarating blur. Devlin Systems went into overdrive. They hired 5 more experienced engineers, including, tellingly, 2 more talented individuals who had recently resigned in disgust from Veltria's imploding IT department. Alan, now fully on board, proved invaluable, building a sophisticated data migration tool capable of translating Westbrook's legacy data into the structure of Devlin's new system. Mark led the architectural charge, designing a modular system that could not only handle Westbrook's current load, but could also scale gracefully as Devlin inevitably grew further. The team worked long hours, fueled by caffeine, pizza, and a shared sense of purpose, a feeling that they were building something important, something right. Halfway through this intense project, Mark received an email. It was from Justin Bayou, Harold's son, the man who sold Veltria, still lingering on the board. "Mark," the email began, "I wanted to reach out personally and apologize, sincerely, for how things ended at Veltria. Looking back, it's clear the board, myself included, were significantly misled about the implications, the risks of letting you go. Graham Vickers has been removed as CTO. The company is struggling mightily to recover. Westbrook's departure is going to hit us incredibly hard financially. I just wanted to say, if you're ever interested in discussing coming back, in any capacity, the door is always open. We made a mistake, a big one. Regards, Justin." Mark read the email, felt a brief flicker of something, maybe pity, maybe just weary acknowledgement, and then deleted it without replying. There was no going back, only forward. 10 weeks into their 12-week deadline, they were ready. Ready for the first stage of the Westbrook rollout. They decided to start with Westbrook's smallest region, about 2,000 units in western New York. If this migration went smoothly, the other, larger regions would follow in quick succession over the next 2 weeks. The pressure was immense. The day before the scheduled migration, Lawrence called Mark into his office again. There was someone else waiting there. A distinguished-looking man in his late 60s, radiating an aura of quiet authority. Lawrence made the introduction. "Mark Foster, I'd like you to meet Jeffrey Westbrook, CEO of Westbrook Properties." Jeffrey Westbrook stood up, extending a firm handshake. "Mr. Foster, Mark, it's a pleasure to finally meet the architect behind the solution," he said, his eyes sharp and appraising. "Lawrence here has been telling me a great deal about you." "All good things, I hope," Mark replied with a small smile. Jeffrey chuckled. "He says you've built us something solid. Something that won't fall apart every time we add a new property. Something designed to actually grow with us, not hold us back. Is he right?" "That's the plan, Mr. Westbrook," Mark confirmed. "Reliability, scalability, and transparency. Built from the ground up." "I also hear," Jeffrey continued, his tone shifting slightly, "that you used to work for Veltria Housing. For quite a long time, in fact." Mark nodded slowly, unsure where this was heading. "Yes, sir. 18 years. They're in trouble, you know," Jeffrey stated matter-of-factly. "Deep trouble. That private equity firm that owns them, they're desperate to sell now, cut their losses. But with Westbrook leaving, with their core systems still unstable and their reputation in tatters, well, let's just say they're not finding many interested buyers." He paused, letting the silence hang for a beat. Except perhaps one. Mark felt a prickle of anticipation. "Who's that?" he asked, though a suspicion was already forming in his mind. Lawrence Devlin spoke, his expression carefully neutral. "Devlin Systems," he said quietly. "We've been approached. We're considering making an offer to acquire Veltria Housing. At a substantial discount, naturally, compared to what they were valued at just 6 months ago." Mark looked from Lawrence to Jeffrey, the implications swirling in his mind. Acquiring Veltria, the company that fired him? Jeffrey Westbrook leaned forward slightly. "Mark, if that acquisition were to happen, and it's still an if, we, as potentially their largest client now under the Devlin umbrella, would want absolute assurance of a smooth transition. We'd want someone leading the technical integration who understands both companies. Someone who knows Veltria's old infrastructure intimately. What's salvageable, what's not. Someone who can manage the migration of all remaining Veltria properties onto your new, stable architecture without disrupting service for thousands of residents." He held Mark's gaze. "Someone like you. Are you asking?" Mark clarified slowly. "If I'd be willing to oversee the technical integration of Veltria into Devlin, should the acquisition go through?" Lawrence nodded. "Only if it happens, Mark. And only if you're comfortable with it. It's a complex situation, personally and professionally. We understand that." Mark thought about it. The irony was almost overwhelming. The system he'd built, nurtured, and been fired for. The company that had discarded him, undervalued him, accused him. All of it potentially coming back under his direction, to be absorbed into the new, better thing he was building. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about gloating. It was about completion. About doing it right, finally. About ensuring the stability and service that should have been prioritized all along. He took a deep breath. "Yes," he said finally. "I'd be willing to lead that integration." He looked at Lawrence, then Jeffrey. "But I have one condition." "Name it," Lawrence said. "We do it right," Mark stated firmly. "No shortcuts. No compromises on quality for speed. Full, proper documentation of everything we integrate or migrate. Proper training for any staff coming over. We stabilize Veltria's operations methodically, we protect the tenant data, and we migrate them carefully onto the new Devlin platform. We learn from their mistakes." Lawrence smiled. Agreed, Mark. Absolutely agreed. We've all learned that lesson, haven't we? As Mark walked back to his office, the weight of the upcoming migration felt slightly overshadowed by the sheer, unexpected turn of events. He felt no vindication, no burning desire for retribution against the ghost of Veltria. Just a quiet, profound satisfaction. The simple, enduring truth that good work, done well, done right, eventually, somehow, speaks for itself. Its value becomes undeniable, even to those who were once blind to it. 6 months later, Mark Foster stood in the lobby of a familiar building. But the sign above the entrance was different. It no longer read Veltria Housing. It now displayed the clean, modern logo of Devlin Integrated Property Management. The acquisition had gone through smoothly, finalized for less than a quarter of Veltria's estimated value just before Mark's departure. He and Lawrence walked through the offices, greeting the former Veltria employees who were being retained through the transition. Some looked away, awkward and perhaps ashamed. Others offered smiles of genuine relief, grateful for the stability Devlin represented. A few, the engineers and staff who had worked closely with Mark for years, nodded with quiet understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the journey. Graham Vickers and most of the executive team responsible for Mark's termination were long gone. Justin Bayou stayed on briefly as a consultant, helping manage legacy client relationships during the handover. When they reached the server room, Mark's old domain, he paused at the glass door, looking in at the racks of hardware he'd specified years ago, the blinking lights of systems he designed and maintained. "Want to go in?" Lawrence asked gently. Mark shook his head. "No need," he replied softly. "We'll be migrating everything to the new infrastructure soon anyway. Time to move forward." In the main conference room, Lawrence introduced Mark not just as the chief systems architect, but as the chief integration officer overseeing the entire technical transition. Looking out at the familiar and new faces, Mark felt no urge to say, "I told you so." What good would it do? Instead, he spoke about the future, about building something better, together, founded on principles of quality, documentation, and mutual respect. The irony was thick, but the message was sincere. A year after the acquisition, Devlin Integrated was the undisputed leader in the Northeast. The migration was complete, all properties running smoothly on the new, fully documented, scalable system Mark had designed. His final act before transitioning fully into his architect role was establishing something close to his heart: a dedicated technical education division within Devlin, focused on training the next generation of engineers not just to code, but to build systems meant to last, systems built with integrity. He hadn't sought revenge. He hadn't needed to. By simply moving forward, focusing on quality, and proving his undeniable worth elsewhere, the scales had balanced themselves. Sometimes the most powerful response to being undervalued isn't anger or retaliation, but the quiet, unwavering act of building something better, something enduring, and letting the results speak for themselves. And so, Mark's journey reminds us that true value isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet hum of a system working perfectly, in the knowledge built over years, in the integrity of doing things right, even when no one seems to be watching. Being underestimated can sting deeply, but it can also be fuel. Fuel to build again, build better, and trust that competence, eventually, finds its own reward, its own quiet victory. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the best way to heal from injustice is simply to create something undeniably good in its wake. If this story resonated with you, perhaps sparked a thought or a feeling about your own journey, please feel free to share your reflections in the comments below. We learn so much from hearing each other's perspectives. And if you'd like to continue walking through these stories of resilience, quiet strength, and earned redemption with us, please consider subscribing to the channel. You're always welcome here. For those who feel moved to support our mission of sharing these powerful narratives, you can use the Super Thanks feature. Giving, in its own way, is part of healing and invites blessing back into our lives. Thank you for listening, truly. We'll be here again soon with another story.